Can you pretend to be my son today? 86-year-old woman asked Hell's Angels. What? The nursing home hallway smelled like disinfectant and old memories. 6 leather-clad bikers stood awkwardly beneath pastel paintings of sunflowers, and in the middle of them, an 86-year-old woman with trembling hands looked up at their leader and whispered, "Can you pretend to be my son today?" The engines were loud enough to rattle the glass doors of Cedar Grove Assisted Living. Residents near the lobby windows leaned forward in their wheelchairs. A nurse paused mid-sentence. The low thunder of Harley-Davidsons rolled through the quiet morning like a storm that didn't belong there. They came in slowly. 6 men in worn leather vests, boots heavy against polished floors, tattoos crawling up their arms like stories that refused to fade. They looked out of place under pastel walls and framed watercolor paintings of lighthouses. At their center stood a tall man with silver in his beard and steady, watchful eyes. His road name was Bishop. His real name didn't matter here. What mattered was the woman waiting for them. Elena Whitmore sat in a padded chair near the reception desk, her back straight despite her age. A pale blue cardigan draped over her narrow shoulders. Her white hair was neatly pinned, as if she were expecting someone important. Her hands trembled in her lap. When Bishop approached, she looked up at him, not afraid, not curious, just desperate. "Are you the motorcycle gentleman?" she asked softly. A few residents whispered. Bishop nodded once. Elena swallowed. Her voice was papery thin, but it carried. "I have something unusual to ask, and I understand if you say no." The lobby felt smaller somehow. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photograph. It was old, edges soft from being held too many times. "That was my son," she said. In the photo, a young man stood beside a red motorcycle, laughing into the sun. "He passed away 5 years ago." Silent! Bishop felt the weight of the picture before he even touched it. "My nephew is coming today," Elena continued. "He says he wants to help with my finances, but he only comes when there are papers involved." Her fingers tightened. "He doesn't believe I can make decisions anymore." She looked up at Bishop, eyes glassy but steady. "He thinks I'm alone." A long breath. "Can you pretend to be my son today?" The question hung in the air. Fragile, impossible. And somewhere behind the reception desk, a nurse pressed her hand to her mouth. Because sometimes the smallest request carries the heaviest truth. Elena hadn't always lived in Cedar Grove. She had once owned a small white house with blue shutters and a garden that bloomed louder than the neighbors' gossip. Roses lined the fence. Wind chimes sang at sunset. Her husband, Thomas, built that house with his own hands. Her son, Daniel, learned to ride a bike in that driveway, and later learned to ride something louder. Motorcycles had terrified her at first. Daniel was 17 when he brought one home. Black, shiny, too fast. She remembered standing on the porch, arms crossed, pretending to be stern. "You'll break your neck," she'd told him. He had just smiled, kissed her cheek, and said, "Not today, Mom." He joined a riding club in his 20s. Not criminals, just men who liked the open road and the feeling of wind tearing through old worries. Daniel was the kind who stopped for stranded cars, the kind who carried jumper cables in his saddlebag. When Thomas passed from a quiet heart attack, Daniel came home every Sunday. Fixed gutters, changed light bulbs, ate roast chicken at her kitchen table. Then one rainy night, a drunk driver crossed a line. Daniel never came home again. The house grew too quiet after that. The garden withered. Her nephew, Craig, appeared more often. At first he brought groceries, helped with paperwork, smiled too widely. Then came conversations about simplifying assets, managing risks, making sure you're safe. Aunt Elena. Last month she discovered a document in her mail, already partially filled out. Power of attorney. Her name printed neatly. Craig's signature waiting for hers. He had circled where she needed to sign. That was the day she called the number she found online. A motorcycle club known for community rides and charity events. She didn't know their rules. She only knew her son had once said, "Never judge a rider by the leather." Now, sitting in the lobby, she watched Bishop studying Daniel's photograph. He looked from the young man in the picture to her trembling hand, and something shifted behind his eyes. "We're not actors, ma'am," one of the younger bikers muttered. Elena nodded slowly. "I know." Bishop folded the photo carefully. Then he said, "Tell us what time your nephew gets here." 10:30, Elena whispered. It was 10:12. The lobby clock ticked too loudly. Bishop glanced at his crew: Hawk, Diesel, Manny, Torch, and Reaper. Men with scars you could see and stories you couldn't. They weren't saints, but they had mothers. Bishop crouched in front of Alina so his eyes met hers. What exactly do you need from us? Her throat worked. He believes I'm confused. He says the doctor will confirm it soon. Pause. He wants control. Before that happens. The nurse behind the desk shifted nervously. She had seen Craig before. His voice smooth but firm in ways that made her uncomfortable. Alina's fingers twisted together. If he thinks I have family here, someone who cares, someone who will question him. She didn't finish. Bishop understood. Craig wasn't expecting resistance. He was expecting a frail woman and polite compliance. All right, Bishop said quietly. He stood tall, straightened his vest, and turned to his men. Family lunch, he said. Hawk grinned faintly. Diesel cracked his knuckles. Reaper pulled out a chair beside Alina and sat close enough that their shoulders touched. You like strawberry milkshakes? He asked gently. Her lips trembled into a smile. Daniel did. Then today, Bishop said, so do we. They positioned themselves around her like a wall, not aggressive, just present. Solid. At 10:29, the glass doors opened. Craig entered first. Crisp button-down shirt, polished shoes, a leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. His wife Melissa followed, heels clicking like judgment. Craig smiled when he saw Alina. Then he froze, because Alina Whitmore was not alone. She was sitting between 6 bikers, laughing softly at something Reaper had whispered. And Bishop, tall, calm, immovable, rested a protective arm around her shoulders. Craig's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed. The air changed. Sometimes power isn't loud. Sometimes it just sits there quietly, daring you to test it. Craig recovered quickly. That was the thing about men like him. They adjusted fast when control slipped. He walked toward the group with a tight smile stretched across his face. Aunt Alina, he said smoothly, ignoring the leather vests for a second. You didn't tell me you were having company. Alina didn't shrink. That alone surprised the nurse behind the desk. Bishop's arm remained resting lightly across her shoulders, not gripping, just there. Morning, Bishop said evenly. You must be Craig. Craig's eyes flicked toward him. And you are. Alina inhaled slowly. My son, she said. The word hung there. Craig blinked. I'm sorry, he laughed lightly. Daniel passed away years ago. Silence. Bishop didn't break eye contact. Funny thing about family, he said. We don't always disappear when someone expects us to. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Craig cleared his throat. Aunt Alina, we have important documents to review. Legal matters. It's best handled privately. Reaper leaned forward slightly. We're family, he said. Nothing private about family. Craig's jaw tightened. The leather folder under his arm suddenly looked smaller. He tried again. Aunt Alina, you've been confused lately. The doctor appointment on Monday. Alina's hand lifted. Steady. I canceled it. Craig's face lost color. You what? I am not confused, she said quietly. I am careful. The room felt charged. Craig forced a chuckle. You're not thinking clearly. We just want what's best for you. Funny, Hawk muttered. That's usually what someone says right before they take something. Craig's eyes flashed. This is inappropriate. I don't know what story she's told you, but Bishop stood slowly, not aggressive, just tall. Then let's read it together, he said calmly, out loud. And for the first time, Craig looked unsure. Because predators rely on silence, and today silence was gone. Craig hesitated only a second before pulling the papers from his folder. His confidence returned in layers. These are standard documents, he said, smoothing them over a nearby table. Power of attorney, asset management, protection. Alina watched him carefully. Bishop stayed standing beside her chair. Go ahead, Bishop said. Read it. Craig forced a thin smile. You wouldn't understand the legal language. Try us. The air felt tight. Craig cleared his throat and began reading. His voice was steady at first, smooth, but the words, when spoken aloud, sounded different. Full control over financial decisions, authority to liquidate property, transfer of assets without further consent. Alina's fingers gripped the armrest. Residents nearby listened quietly. When Craig reached the clause about selling her home, his voice faltered slightly. Torch stepped closer. Sounds like you're taking everything, he said. That's not what it means, Craig snapped. Then explain it better, Bishop replied. Craig's polished composure cracked. It's for her safety. She can't manage these things anymore. Alina's voice cut through the tension. I balance my checkbook every month. Craig looked at her sharply. You forgot to pay the electricity bill last spring. Eleanor's eyes hardened. Because you told me you would handle it. A quiet murmur rippled through the lobby. Melissa shifted her weight. Craig's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself, Aunt Elena. Bishop stepped forward slightly. She doesn't look embarrassed to me. Craig looked around, at the nurses watching, at the bikers surrounding Elena, at the residents whispering. His power was thinning. Fine, he muttered. If she doesn't sign today, she'll regret it. The threat was subtle, but everyone heard it. Elena looked up at Bishop, and for the first time in months, her hands were no longer shaking. Then I suppose, she said softly, I won't sign. Craig's face darkened. You don't know what you're doing. No, Bishop replied calmly. She does. Craig leaned closer to Elena. You think these men will stick around when the bills pile up, when things get hard? Before she could answer, Manny spoke. We're not here for her money. Craig scoffed. Everyone's here for something. Yeah, Hawk said quietly. Sometimes it's just respect. Tension pressed heavy against the walls. Elena slowly reached into her purse again. She pulled out another document, not the one Craig had prepared. This one was different. I saw my lawyer yesterday, she said. Craig froze. You what? I asked questions, she continued. Real ones. Bishop glanced at the paper. It was a revocation form. Craig's name printed clearly, his authority officially cancelled. I won't be bullied, Elena said, voice steady. Not in my own life. Craig looked stunned. Melissa tugged at his sleeve. We should go, she whispered, but Craig wasn't done. You'll regret this, he said through clenched teeth. Elena held his gaze. I already regret trusting you. The words hit harder than any shout. Craig gathered his papers stiffly. As he turned to leave, Bishop added quietly, Don't come back without kindness. The doors shut behind them. The engines outside started again, not in threat, but in finality. Elena exhaled a breath she'd been holding for months. Sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply says no. The lobby slowly returned to life. Whispers softened. Nurses resumed their work, but something had changed. Elena looked smaller again somehow, not fragile, but tired. Bishop knelt beside her chair. You all right, Ma? She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed softly through tears. I forgot what it felt like, she admitted. What? Reaper asked gently. To not be alone. The words landed quietly. Bishop glanced at Daniel's photograph still resting on the table. He'd be proud, he said. Her lips trembled. You remind me of him, she whispered. Bishop looked down briefly. I had a mother, he said quietly. Lost her before I learned how to say sorry. The men fell silent. Elena reached for his hand. Then stay for lunch, she said, and they did. They wheeled her to the dining hall, sat around plastic trays and lukewarm soup like it was a five-star restaurant. They laughed too loudly. They argued about motorcycles and weather. They made her smile in a way that reached her eyes. Residents who hadn't spoken in days leaned closer to listen. Because sometimes joy is contagious, and sometimes healing begins with a table full of strangers who decide you matter. Word spread quickly through Cedar Grove. By afternoon, every resident knew about the bikers. Some were curious, some nervous, most just watched. Bishop and his crew didn't leave after lunch. They stayed. They fixed a loose railing near the garden, adjusted a flickering light in the hallway. Diesel carried groceries for a nurse whose back ached from overtime shifts. No one asked them to, they just did it. Elena watched from her chair near the window. Her hands rested peacefully in her lap. For the first time in months, no shadow hovered near her. That evening, as the sun painted the sky soft orange, Bishop sat beside her outside. You called us because Daniel rode, he said gently. She nodded. He said bikers take care of their own. Bishop looked toward his parked motorcycle. We try. Elena hesitated. Would it be terribly selfish, she asked quietly, if I asked you to visit again? Bishop didn't answer right away. He watched the wind move through the small garden. Then he said, family doesn't need an invitation. Her eyes filled again. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do at 86 is ask for love. The following Sunday, the engines returned, not as a storm, but as a promise. This time, residents waited at the windows with smiles. Elena sat straighter than usual. She wore Daniel's old scarf around her neck. Bishop walked in carrying a small box. For you, he said. Inside was a framed photo. Daniel's original picture, restored, cleaned, placed beside a new one. Elena, surrounded by 6 bikers in the Cedar Grove lobby. Family. She pressed the frame to her chest. I didn't lose a son. The Sundays became routine, not the kind written on calendars, the kind written into bones. At 1:00 p.m., like clockwork, the low rumble of engines would roll into the Cedar Grove parking lot. Residents who once complained about noise now asked nurses to wheel them closer to the windows. Elena waited by the entrance every time, not anxious anymore, expectant. Bishop always removed his helmet before walking in. A small gesture, respectful, human. "Afternoon, Ma," he would say, and every single time her face lit up as if she were seeing Daniel walk through the door again. But it wasn't denial, it wasn't replacement, it was presence. One Sunday, Bishop noticed a man sitting alone in the corner of the common room. Late 70s, military posture even in a soft chair. A Vietnam veteran named Arthur who hadn't spoken much since arriving months ago. Bishop walked over. "Mind if I sit?" Arthur looked at the leather vest, the patches, the gray in Bishop's beard. "You ride?" Arthur asked quietly. "Every chance I get." Arthur nodded toward the window. "I used to, after the war. Road was the only place. My head got quiet." The words were heavy. Bishop understood. By the end of the afternoon, Arthur was telling stories, real ones, about open highways and lost friends. The room felt warmer. Meanwhile, Elena watched from across the hall, eyes soft. "You see that?" she whispered to Nurse Emily. "They're not just here for me." She was right. Torch helped Mrs. Peterson set up her old record player. Manny adjusted Mr. Green's hearing aid battery. Reaper read aloud from a mystery novel to 3 residents who leaned in like children at story time. No speeches, no announcements, just men who decided to show up. That evening, as Bishop walked Elena back to her room, she touched his arm. "Daniel always said the road connects strangers," she murmured. Bishop smiled faintly. "Maybe it just reminds us we're not meant to travel alone." Somewhere in the building, laughter echoed where silence once lived. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell quietly over Cedar Grove, covering the parking lot in a soft white sheet. The engines still came. They just sounded deeper against the cold air. Inside, Elena's health shifted gently, almost invisibly at first. A little more fatigue, a little more time spent resting. Bishop noticed. He always noticed. One Sunday, he found her staring out the window, Daniel's scarf folded neatly in her lap. "You tired today?" he asked softly. "A little," she admitted. "Bodies don't last forever." He didn't argue. She turned toward him slowly. "Do you know why I was really afraid that day you walked in?" He shook his head. "I wasn't afraid of Craig." Pause. "I was afraid of disappearing." The words settled between them. "My husband gone, my son gone, my house sold." People speak over you at this age. Decisions made around you. You start to feel transparent. Bishop leaned back in his chair. "My mom used to say the worst kind of loneliness is being unseen." Elena nodded. "When you all sat beside me, I felt visible again." The breathing was shallow but steady. "You didn't just pretend to be my son," she continued. "You reminded me I still matter." Bishop's throat tightened. Outside, snow began falling heavier. Inside, warmth gathered in small pockets around conversations, around shared silence. That night, Bishop sat on his motorcycle longer than usual before starting the engine. Some bonds are formed on highways, others in quiet rooms where someone finally feels seen, and both can change a life. The call came on a Tuesday morning, not Sunday, not expected. Bishop was in his garage when his phone vibrated. Nurse Emily's voice trembled slightly on the other end. "She's asking for you." He didn't hesitate. By the time the engines pulled into Cedar Grove, the sky was gray and still. The lobby felt different, quieter. Bishop walked quickly down the hallway, boots echoing softly. Elena lay in her bed, sunlight barely reaching her pillow. She looked smaller now, but her eyes were clear. "You came," she whispered. "Of course." The other bikers waited respectfully outside the room. Bishop pulled a chair close and took her hand, thin, cool, fragile. "I think," she said slowly, "Daniel's been waiting." Tears gathered in the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. "You don't have to go anywhere alone," he said gently. She smiled faintly. "You made sure of that." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy, it was soft. "I was so angry when Daniel died," she admitted. "Angry at the road, at the rain, at motorcycles, a weak breath. Now I'm grateful for them." Her fingers tightened faintly around his. Promise me something, anything. Keep showing up for people who feel invisible. His voice broke. I promise. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Tell the boys thank you. I will. Her breathing slowed. Not dramatic, not sudden, just gentle, like someone finally setting down a burden. And as Bishop sat there, holding her hand, he realized something simple and devastating. Sometimes pretending becomes real, and sometimes love arrives exactly when it's needed most. The funeral was small, simple, just the way Alina would have wanted. A modest church with stained glass windows casting colored light across wooden pews. Residents from Cedar Grove filled the front rows. Nurses stood quietly near the back, and 6 bikers in leather vests sat together, heads bowed. Craig did not attend. No one seemed surprised. Bishop stood when the pastor invited anyone to speak. He walked slowly to the front, helmet tucked beneath his arm. I wasn't her son, he began. His voice was steady but thick. But she called me one. He paused, letting that truth settle. She asked us to pretend. We thought we were helping her. A faint smile touched his face. Turns out she was helping us. Soft murmurs of agreement filled the room. She reminded us that strength isn't loud, that dignity doesn't fade with age, that people don't stop needing love just because time has passed. He looked toward the front pew where Daniel's restored photo rested beside her casket. She was never invisible. We were just lucky enough to notice. When he returned to his seat, Repo wiped his eyes roughly. Outside, the engines started together, not as a roar, but as a salute. And somewhere in the quiet space between grief and gratitude, peace settled in. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The visits didn't stop. Even though Alina was gone, Bishop and his crew kept coming. Arthur waited by the window every Sunday. Mrs. Peterson saved a seat for Torch. The staff no longer looked surprised when leather boots echoed down the hallway. Cedar Grove felt different now, alive in small ways. The bikers organized a garden restoration in Alina's name. Residents planted roses along the courtyard fence. Blue shutters were painted on a wooden shed near the patio, a quiet nod to the house she once loved. A small plaque was placed beneath a bench in honor of Alina Whitmore, who reminded us that family can be found. One afternoon, Nurse Emily approached Bishop. She changed this place, she said softly. He shook his head. No, he replied, she just reminded us what we were capable of. Sometimes impact isn't loud. Sometimes it's a ripple that keeps moving long after someone is gone. And every time engines rolled into the parking lot, residents felt it, not noise, not fear, but belonging. Years later, the tradition continued. New residents arrived, old ones passed peacefully, but Sundays still carried the sound of motorcycles. You could see it in their faces, the way people straightened when the doors opened, as if hope had just walked in. Bishop grew older too, more silver in his beard, slower to stand. But every time he entered Cedar Grove, he glanced toward the bench in the garden. The roses bloomed brighter each spring. One afternoon, a new resident, a quiet woman with nervous hands, stopped him in the hallway. Are you the one who pretended to be someone's son? She asked. He smiled softly. For a day, he replied. She hesitated. Could you sit with me for a while? He nodded, because sometimes the story never really ends. It just changes faces, and somewhere beyond memory, beyond grief, beyond time. An 86-year-old woman who once feared disappearing had become the reason no one else had.